like in a real conference.
Oh, yeah. Okay, good evening everyone. Thanks very much for coming along to this, the second in AIC's series of talks on rhetor interpreting. I'd also like to thank Clare Donovan for agreeing to give the talk this evening and for finding these excellent premises for us to meet on. We've got about 20 people following this online, I hope, although we've had a couple of technical hitches already so far this evening. The format will be that Claire will give a presentation now of about 30 minutes or so, and at the end, if you've got any questions, then there'll be time to ask questions. And the same goes for people listening online. Those questions will come in through a chat, and I think I'll probably have to read them out so that everyone can hear them. But that's the format, and hopefully we'll be able to send you home before 8:30, 9 o'clock, something like that. 8:30, that's it. Okay, over to Claire.
Thank you very much, Andy, and good evening, everybody, to people who are here in the room, and also everybody who's watching from a distance. The title that I've given to this presentation, which is not posted anywhere, is Can and Should One Interpret in Simultaneous into a B Language? Which is a rather provocative title, given the audience, but was chosen deliberately to translate, I suspect, one of the reasons we're all here this evening, which is basically a certain amount of anxiety about working into B in simultaneous. I'm now going to sort of grossly oversimplify and identify two attitudes towards simultaneous into B. In the past, many people who wrote about interpreting worked in a geographical and political context in which simultaneous in B was standard practice. And mostly they didn't consider the possible added difficulty of working into an acquired language. Not only did they not consider that, they even tended to assume, on the contrary, that the greater intuition in understanding the A language would lead to better interpretation. So these people highlighted what I've called the comprehension bonus of working into B. The other extreme to which I was exposed during my studies was that a B should never be used in simultaneous, only for consecutive purposes, because there would be contamination, poor expression, lack of speed, and so on. So this approach tends to emphasize the expression deficit rather than the comprehension bonus. Interestingly, and I think you'll agree, both of these attitudes sound a little bit outdated today and a little bit extreme in a situation in which most people who have a B language use it in simultaneous for all kinds of reasons. So the question is, really, should we be doing this? Well, I think if we're here or if we're listening, it's because we all work in B simultaneous, or at least we're all planning to work into B. So presumably we don't share the latter view that it's not something that can be done. On the other hand, the fact that we are here this evening would seem to confirm that there are some concerns and worries related to simultaneous into B. And so we don't share the former view either, that it's easier or better to work into B. So perhaps, first of all, we could try and define a B language. But before that, I would like to point out, and looking at some of the people in the room, I think they will sympathize with this, that many interpreters, for various reasons, don't fit into the neat A and B and C categories. Many interpreters have grown up with two or several languages, which they acquired in parallel or consecutively during their childhood or their early adolescence. So what happens in this case is that some of their world experience is learnt in one language and some in another or through another. and they may be fully accepted as native speakers in both or all of these languages, but nevertheless they'll have gaps, as indeed we all do in any language actually. And I'm thinking also of colleagues from, say, Africa or the Indian subcontinent who work in interpreting with languages they acquired through schooling and not the language that they learnt at home or they use at home. So we have lots of interpreters who've acquired their world knowledge and experience at a fairly early age through different languages. Nonetheless, I will address the issue of the B language definition, even if there is a whole range of situations from a completely acquired B that was learnt at an almost adult age, right down to somebody who grew up with what has become their B language. So I looked up the IEC definition of a B language, and we have it here. It says, rather unhelpfully actually, but I think there was as stuck as I was, that a B language is a language other than the interpreter's native language, of which she or he has perfect command, and into which she or he works from one or more of the other languages. So this sounds very much like a very good A language, but with perhaps a slight foreign accent. The AZ brochure gives quite a lengthy definition, but what it amounts to is that the difference between A and B is that occasionally there may be a lack of elegance or slight clumsiness in B, and also a slight foreign accent. But again, we get the notion of a perfect command. So I was wondering, why does this sound so idealistic and actually quite improbable to those of us who work with B languages? And I think it's because many people, but probably not interpreters, assume that you can pick up a language as effortlessly as they think they learnt their first language or languages. But actually the process of learning any language, including the first language, is very complex and very gradual. But when you're learning a first language at an early age, as you grow and mature, the language accompanies a broader psychological, cognitive, and social development of the individual and becomes bound up with that individual. So the world is experienced and explained and commented on in that first language or languages. But when you then go on to acquire a language in the schoolroom or as an adult, the language centers of the brain have already been molded by the structures of that first language or first languages. And the clearest evidence of this is the difficulty that language learners have to even hear, let alone reproduce, the phonemes that do not exist in their first language when they're learning a new language. So fundamental difference, I think, between an A and a B is that a B is a language that's been imported or grafted on to pre-existing language structures. And this means that in a B language, one doesn't have what one senses as a kind of intuition as one has in the A language. And I think this point is actually vital to understanding our worries and our approach to interpreting into B, particularly in simultaneous. I just quoted here Carla de Jong, who says, in an acquired language, we do not have the support of instinct. Okay, this is what I was trying to describe in more complex terms, and the basic sense of language which guides us and dictates, as if by magic, and I will come back to this expression, the most appropriate way of expressing our thoughts. So this intuition that we have in A is actually far from infallible, but it's interesting that, just to take the examples of French and English, if you ask a French A whether a word is masculine or feminine, they will give you an answer, which is sometimes wrong, actually, but they think they know. If you ask an English native speaker which preposition goes with which verb, the same thing. Again, they may get it wrong, but they think they know on the whole. These are all features that have to be learnt in B, but not only learnt once, but they have to be constantly rehearsed and learnt anew. And so what this means for those of us who need to, or have chosen to work into B, is that as we don't have the magic mentioned by Carla de Jean, we're going to have to replace that magic with hard work. And also, clearly, that a B language can be a source of anxiety, to come back to the word that I used at the beginning. So, is working into B acceptable? When I say working, I'm always thinking about simultaneous, because we'll leave the consecutive issue to one side for the time being. I think that views about how legitimate it is to work into one's B language in simultaneous are necessarily subject to the broader context and are coloured by numerous situational factors. And just to illustrate this, I'd like to compare two surveys that were carried out amongst interpreters who do the retour. The first one was conducted by myself about 10 years ago in Paris, and it was with colleagues working with French and English both ways, so into B, either French or English. And all of them, with one exception, which was an older interpreter, said that they found it more tiring and stressful to do the retour than work into their A language. And they also felt that their work into B was less satisfactory in terms of quality and, interestingly, of accuracy. So much for the comprehension bonus. However, this can be compared to a survey carried out by a Hungarian colleague at Zabari with interpreters with Hungarian A and English B working in Hungary. And more than a third of those interpreters said they preferred to work into B, and they thought that they did better into B. It's interesting to compare the two situations. Clearly, in the latter situation, the interpreters are working into B in a direction which is highly appreciated and absolutely indispensable. I imagine there are few English listeners who understand Hungarian. There's also no nagging and annoying benchmark of A language interpreters, or very few in Hungary. There are very few English A interpreters who work from Hungarian. And also, it's probably more satisfying to work into a language of broader diffusion than into a language which has fewer listeners, perhaps. These are just theories that I have. Whereas the interpreters working into French or English in Paris all have a fairly high-level benchmark of native language interpreters working in that direction, and also know that there are many people who could do it into their A language. And I think also the initial views fairly extreme views of the past that I described, can be clearly understood from the situation and context in which people were working. Thinking particularly of the first view, which was very prevalent in the former Soviet Union and the satellite countries, where there were no interpreters with the B languages they were using. So what do users think about all of this? Well, there have been lots of user satisfaction surveys carried out, very few of which have actually asked questions about directionality. Most of them simply asked what it was that the users wanted from interpretation and whether they were satisfied. And to try and fill that gap, I conducted a survey in 2003 of conference participants, not with a table asking them to tick off what it is they wanted and whether they were happy, but through interviews with them, trying to get them to talk about interpreting spontaneously and say what they thought about interpreting generally. What was interesting was that the notion of a B language, which is, of course, a technical term, I wasn't expecting them to say a B language, but that notion never, ever arose spontaneously in the interviews. It's something that just never came up. They had a very clear idea of what they wanted. Their priorities were that the interpreter should make sense, which is fair enough, I guess, and that they should be clear and use appropriate terminology. Now, these are not qualities that are specific to an A language. They didn't mention perfect syntax or very idiomatic expression or native accent. They also expressed fairly equal satisfaction with the interpretation they'd heard when people were working into B and when they were working into A. So ultimately, it seems that their degree of satisfaction was more dependent on interpreting technique, in other words, the ability of the individual interpreter, than on directionality. There is a caveat to that, which we'll come back to later, about complete breakdown, which occurred much more working into B and was obviously not satisfactory. I'd just like to show here an example. This is taken from a class at AZIT. And the first indent is the original English that was used. It was a speech given by a newspaper editor at a conference of journalists, and which had been oralized by one of the students. It was talking about the difficulties that journalists had had to adapt to computer technology. So it's strange that journalists rejected computer technology and were very attached to their manual typewriters while the rest of the country was moving on, etc. And the first student produced the following: Les journalistes rejetaient l'électronique, ils s'attachaient à leur machine à écrire. Okay, this is a student working. You can see quite clearly the student's having a lot of trouble actually working with meaning and getting away from the words of the original, and that it's very, very bogged down in words and is not terribly clear or spontaneous sounding. The second student said, Justement, nous, les journalistes, avons eu du mal à nous habituer au traitement de texte et à renoncer à la machine à écrire. Okay, now the only reason I'm showing you this is because in the first instance it was a student working into their A language, and in the second into the B language. So this is simply to say that, to confirm the view of that emerged from the user satisfaction survey, that it can work into B and it doesn't have to work into A. Let's put it that way. Having said that, and this is interesting, most interpreters, no matter how experienced or how confident in their B language, and no matter how many years they've been living in the country of their B language, still refuse or try and avoid interpreting into B for certain types of speeches, such as after-dinner speeches or key political statements or televised interviews conducted live and so on. So there does seem to be some kind of problem there that I'd like to explore now. So what are the specific difficulties of simultaneous into B? The first difficulty really relates to the quality of a B language that I've already touched upon. And the heading that I'll use is the lazy brain, because it's not really a matter of laziness so much as being economical with our resources. I think you'll probably recognize what I'm about to describe, and that is you're learning a language, so we'll assume that this is going to become your B language, and there's a period initially when the language is very visible to you. You actually see and hear the elements of the language, and this is a period in which one is often very surprised at the way in which this language describes the world and how strange it is. And it's a kind of hump that you have in which the language is fairly opaque. During that period, you make a lot of progress because you have to. It's so visible, it's there, it's so obvious. But once you get over that hump, which happens actually quite quickly, and you begin to feel fairly comfortable. But ironically, it's precisely then that the proficiency in terms of precision and range of vocabulary and flexibility begins to stagnate. And this comfort plateau is very often reached way before any acceptable degree of proficiency for interpreting purposes. The speakers develop a persona in this new language, without actually realizing that it's a very truncated persona. And they don't realize, because in everyday communication, one can quite easily have the impression that one is fairly fluent, both in understanding and expression. What's happening is that there's a lot of self-censorship going on. Self-censorship in that we tend not to expose ourselves to new situations. We select the means of expression that we use. In other words, we say what we can say. And we can fill gaps in comprehension because we're familiar with the situation, or simply we brush aside what we haven't understood. Now, of course, none of this is going to hold up under the stress of interpretation. And this means that very often when students and young interpreters start to work into their B language, they discover all kinds of gaps that they never suspected were there. Because interpretation imposes considerable constraints on our mental resources, and particularly on our expression resources. Unlike probably almost any everyday situation, the interpreter is required to produce a complete and faithful rendition of somebody else's ideas, and this with a set style and a set register. The utterances that need to be reproduced are technical, specialized, complex, or sensitive in nature, or all of the above. And I think we agree that conference interpreters cannot just get across the gist of the meaning, they have to get across all of the nuances. So this task, which is difficult in one's A language, is actually very daunting in B, because expression is not as spontaneous or as reliable, and not as robust as in A. So there's this fallibility of the B language. And strangely enough, the so-called comprehension bonus, which probably does exist if you're working from your A language, doesn't seem to offset in any valid way the expression deficit. The difficulty, particularly in simultaneous, to move more specifically to simultaneous, I think is not so much as the layman often supposes, and we're often asked how we do this, of listening and speaking at the same time, but more of maintaining a meaning equivalent rendition, but one that is linguistically distinct. And I've quoted Marianne Lederer here, who describes simultaneous, perhaps a little pessimistically, but still, as une lutte constante contre l'autre langue, effort délibéré de disjonction de la forme à donner et de la forme reçue. Now, the problem when you're working into B is compounded by the fact that the drag of the source language is coming from a language in which you have more intuition, more spontaneous expression, and which is stronger. And therefore, it's a fairly unequal battle, contrary to when you're working into A. The problem of interference of A language terms and structures is present even in spontaneous expression in B. But of course, it's exacerbated when one is interpreting, and especially in simultaneous, when your attention is divided between two soundtracks at the same time. So I think an inherent problem of retour interpreting is this difficulty, and this can be placed in the context of Daniel Gilles' efforts model, I think, of maintaining an authentic sounding expression whilst carrying out this complex, multiple series of tasks in interpreting in a language in which the expression is already very vulnerable. And of course, any increase in the demands placed on expression is going to lead to an overload of mental resources. And I think this is why nearly all the interpreters I spoke to identified the same difficulties of retour interpreting, which are that it can be okay so long as what's been said is fairly predictable and the form is fairly predictable, but as soon as you have a sudden shift of any type, it takes much longer to move with the speaker. So anything that is surprising, like a joke or an anecdote, shifts in register, sudden change in subject matter, all of these cause an overload in the interpreting. I'd just like to give a very basic example of this, and this is of the difficulty of task coordination in B. This is an interpreter working into perfectly sound B, a very experienced interpreter, to conference on fisheries. And the original was a marked increase in aquaculture output and trade. The interpreter, and this was a drafting session, said une nette augmentation de la production et des échanges, so far so good, agricole. Now this is a fisheries conference. The interpreter knew it was a fisheries conference. It was about halfway through. And the interpreter, the acoustic conditions were not good. It was hard to differentiate acoustically between the aquaculture, agriculture. But the interpreter repeated agricole 3 times before correcting it. And when we discussed this afterwards, she said, oh yes, I was completely obsessed by getting the words right because it was a drafting session, that I couldn't divide my attention between that and analysing what was being said. So, of course, this could happen into A with an inexperienced or an inexpert interpreter. The data came from the user satisfaction survey in which I'd recorded a lot of interpreting. It could happen, but we didn't find any instances of this kind of rather inexplicable, unless one uses a reference to the fact that it's a B language, shift in words when people were working into A. And there were several instances when working into B. There's another difficulty that personally I think has been very underestimated, and that's the whole issue of self-monitoring. I said that in simultaneous, one has to maintain an equivalent but linguistically autonomous discourse. And this, of course, requires considerable effort. Self-monitoring is a vital part, I think, of the process. And indeed, it is a vital part of all speech. I was interested to read a recent study by an author called Perkel in the United States, which demonstrated that auditory monitoring is actually essential to coherent speech production, even in ordinary speech, let alone in simultaneous. The simultaneous interpreter is not only actively developing a construct of the speaker's meaning through a very complex process of combining language input with inference and contextualization skills, but the interpreter is also at the same time comparing 2 discourses, the original and his or her own interpretation. And the 2 discourses have to be checked for meaning equivalence, but also be kept distinct in formal terms. So the interpreter has to monitor the target language expression for pronunciation, prosody, coherence, and also for lack of contamination from the A language. So there's self-monitoring that focuses on the substance, but also on the form. And the problem when working into a B language is that the monitoring often provides either negative feedback or uncertainty. Because the expression skills are less robust than the understanding and recognition proficiency, the interpreter will often hear herself say things that she recognizes as not quite right. And because there's lack of intuition, she will often hear herself saying things that she's not sure about. And this causes a considerable amount of worry and concern. Leads to the tendency to focus on the language and to start to self-correct supposed or real language errors to the detriment of listening to the message. And so what happens, and what I observed in the transcripts of the interpretation I'd recorded, was that often simultaneous into B is less accurate in terms of content, so much, again, for the comprehension bonus, than simultaneous, even from a fairly shaky C into an A language. And this probably explains the feature that I touched upon before about the B language interpretation. I said that the users on the whole were quite satisfied with the interpreters who'd been working into B, and indeed had not even really thought much about the fact that they were working into a non-native language. They were quite surprised when their attention was drawn to that. It wasn't that they hadn't noticed, it just didn't seem relevant to them. But there were several instances in the B language interpretation of almost a complete breakdown in meaning, that meaning was not maintained. And I tried to understand why this had happened, and I'd just like to give one example, which I'll comment on a little bit, because it's fairly typical of what was observed. Okay, that's this one. This again was a perfectly good interpreter working from Turkish A into French B, and the French was acceptable. And then during a technical presentation about the Turkish road hauliers, the interpreter encountered too many problems of terminology and probably subject matter as well to be able to maintain a coherent interpretation. So I'll just read it out for those who haven't got it up. The first, it starts off fine with a few grammatical mistakes, but probably not a problem for the listeners. En ce qui concerne le transport international, je voudrais brièvement vous donner quelques informations. Il y a près de 900 entreprises turques qui sont actives dans ce secteur et ils possèdent environ 25 000 camions d'une capacité totale de 700 000 tonnes environ. Okay, probably this is also a beginning of overload with the figures. La plus grande, and then there was quite a long pause because she couldn't find the right word, flotte, en quelque sorte, de camions de l'Europe, rencontre beaucoup d'obstacles en ce qui concerne l'obtention de permis, then another long pause. Nous le considérons comme des obstacles qui ne sont pas compris dans les tarifs. Okay, so I think you'll agree this is not terribly clear, and the interpreter was sounding very shaky at this stage. And the first obvious translation difficulty is the flotte. And here, the interpreter, getting the negative feedback, feels compelled to comment on the interpreting and sort of attenuate it, and says, en quelque sorte. Okay, this is clearly not helpful for the listener, but it's a natural reaction on the part of someone trying to communicate. So the expression feedback here is very negative. And from then on, the expression problems accumulate and cause the interpreter to lose the thread of the reasoning. And also to produce something that les obstacles qui ne sont pas compris dans les tarifs, which presumably is non-tariff barriers, but really is a very, very clumsy and strange paraphrase. So just to sum up the difficulties, the added strain of non-intuitive monitoring of expression when working into B, and also the fact that expression resources are stretched all the time to their limit, make interpreting into B very vulnerable to any added difficulty in the original speech. But the difficulties are not necessarily the same as when you're working into A. They're the difficulties that I've mentioned. And the tendency for at least inexperienced interpreters, or anyone who starts to panic actually when working into B, is to focus on language conversion and formal expression. And this generates an introverted, circular process that gets further and further removed from actually listening to what the speaker is trying to say. And it leads to working with smaller chunks of meaning so that the overall speech coherence becomes blurred. It makes very poor use of the interpreter's potential ability because the confidence and intuition that one would have working from an A language are wasted, and all the emphasis is being put on what is bound to be the interpreter's weakest skill, which is transposing words quickly from A into B. So is there a problem? Well, I think the answer is yes, and that's probably why you're here and why people are listening. What is the nature of the problem? Well, I think there are a number of problems. First of all, the lack of intuition and the poor feedback which means that too much time tends to be spent on self-criticism and self-correction of form. And then the stretched expression resources with an overload or breakdown that can be caused by the various points that we've mentioned. So insufficiently prepared technical terms, deliberate effects of style, anecdotes, jokes, changes in register, sudden change of subject, speed, all of which generates self-doubt, embarrassment, fear and anxiety, which is not, of course, ideal to be confident as an interpreter. So that's a pretty grim picture. Fortunately, there's another part to this. It follows from the above, I think, that the interpreter working into B is going to have to really replace this intuition, the magic, everything that one's acquired throughout one's childhood, with conscious and deliberate learning strategies, and combat uncertainties through very careful and active preparation. So I've tried to identify a number of goals that we can set ourselves when interpreting into B. The first is perhaps not to be over-ambitious about a B language. So I've described this as the capsule wardrobe or the tidy toolkit approach, rather than the department store approach. Okay, to come to the wardrobe. Then venturing out of the comfort zone. I mentioned this comfort plateau, which is, of course, not sufficient for interpreting. Asking oneself the question of what is distracting about our production in B, because I think that's a more relevant question for the listeners than some of the other questions we tend to ask ourselves about, am I speaking perfectly? And this brings me to another point, which is perhaps not necessarily to try and imitate native speakers. Activate preparation and make the most of our strengths, in other words, make the most of the comprehension bonus, and be selective about the work that one accepts, if that's possible, which I accept is not necessarily possible. And also, I must say that the list of things that tend to cause the breakdown cannot necessarily be avoided in interpreting. One can always prepare more actively, but it's hard to tell speakers they're not allowed to use jokes or give anecdotes. So I'll just go through these quickly. The first point, the ability to use a B language simply and accurately, I think is essential for an interpreter. I don't think it's necessarily very useful to build up actively, passively yes, but actively a huge word bank. And nor is it necessarily very helpful to learn off by heart interesting sayings, metaphors and proverbs, which in any case are often used inappropriately in B, making the native listeners smile or wince. Roderick Jones pointed out that it's very important to avoid overreaching oneself in stylistic terms. And I have an example here, again taken from a class, of a student working from Polish A into English B. And I just wrote down a couple of the extracts of her interpretation. She was making a big effort to sound more professional and to use a very sort of conference register. The result is quite startling in some ways. However, this was a speech about Turkey's application for membership to the EU, still a topical issue. However, Turkey did not agree that it would succumb to the other countries' requests, and you cannot just ponder on this issue in civilizational aspects. Okay, the listener really has to tease out here the meaning from the muddle of words, and the terms succumb and ponder, which are probably best avoided in B anyway, sound rather strange. And also the interpreter, because she's devoting so much effort to finding nice terms in English, is working with very small chunks of meaning, so that there's a loss of coherency and an inappropriate use of linking words, the example here with the just. Now, I should stress this student had perfectly sound English B. It was not really a problem of B, but of method. The second point, the comfort zone. Actually, the good news here is that you cannot stay in your comfort zone when you're interpreting into B, I think. the constraints to which one's exposed will shake anyone out of that complacency. So you have to get off your plateau and start climbing again. The difficulty in doing this is that at the stage when one starts interpreting studies or starts to interpret into B, understanding has become more or less automatic. So the formal means of expression in the B language are not being registered anymore. So this is going to require a really deliberate and conscious effort all the time to listen carefully to how native speakers use the language and to scan speeches and articles, and it really does require a tremendous effort. I think also to be able to integrate more appropriate and correct forms of expression, one has to do active language enhancement. It's not enough simply to read and to listen. And I'm forever telling the students that they have to do sight translation. I'm a firm believer in the benefits of sight translation, particularly in this context. We're talking about simultaneous into B, because sight translation mimics simultaneous to a large extent in the fact that one's exposed to two sources. But the self-monitoring is a lot easier than in the booth, and sight translation is extremely unforgiving. When you get stuck, you know you've got stuck, and there's no way round it. Also giving speeches out loud in a B language and various other methods such as learning by heart, passages and so on. I mentioned the third point was to identify anything that is distracting in one's own output. I think the term distracting is actually extremely useful in understanding what needs to be corrected and what one can leave. And ideally, we should record ourselves, I think, from time to time when working in simultaneous into B and put ourselves through the grueling ordeal of listening to that recording. Not so much with a view to panicking and thinking, my God, it was absolutely hopeless, but simply identifying anything that would be annoying or distracting. And probably ideally this should be done with a cooperative and understanding native speaker to help. And then try and eliminate the annoying habits or language features from the output. I said there's no need to imitate a native speaker. I say this because I've seen so many students who have gone to tremendous pains to acquire very idiomatic speech patterns in their B language, to acquire what they hope or think is a totally authentic accent in the B language. And yet, the B language still remains very much a B, and I feel that they've devoted their energy to the wrong features of the language, because it's never entirely convincing anyway. So perhaps just I would say there quite simply, let's face it, a B language is not an A language, and that's just the way it is. So let's use the strengths we have in our B language, this neat, tidy toolkit that we've got, which is probably a strength, and our intuition of understanding working from A. I mentioned the need for active language enhancement. This also includes preparation. Of course, I'm sure that we all prepare our conferences. I suspect that a lot of the preparation we do after the first few conferences of our careers tends to be fairly passive, in that we look through the documents, we get a rough understanding of what's going on, and we draw up a glossary. This may or may not be satisfactory when working into A, and it's a whole different issue. But when working into B, I think that it's clearly not satisfactory, because in B you want to be able to have not only an idea of the subject matter and the technical terms per se, but also have really thought about how the speakers are going to be expressing those ideas in broader terms, and hence how one should be doing that as well. So I think that the preparation has to be much more active, in that one has to make a much more conscious effort of noting how ideas are expressed. But also, I would again recommend sight translation from the documents into B, and giving speeches out loud to oneself, in the B language about the documents, about the subject matter and the various speeches. The sixth point, working to one's strengths, okay, is the understanding of the source language. So to make the most of the comprehension bonus, once one has built up this capsule wardrobe of handy expressions and neat, tidy ways of saying things, once one has done the active preparation, from then on, I think it's important to focus on communication and analysis as much as possible, and to try and avoid getting drawn into this sort of very negative eddy that I mentioned, where you're caught up in self-criticism, self-correction, and you stop listening to what's being said. So the emphasis really must be working to communicate to the users. And I think it can be very helpful to look at the users, so long, of course, they don't start to take their headsets off and turn round and all these things that worry us so much when we're working into B. And also to keep up the momentum of the interpretation. So not to have too long pauses, to try and really keep up a fairly fast momentum so that you don't give yourself time to start to worry about the expression and have all these problems of self-criticism. One point of discipline I think we can apply is not to offer alternative expression suggestions, not to give the listeners a kind of à la carte, maybe this, but perhaps that, or rather that, which dilutes the meaning for them and also makes the interpreter feel even more uncertain about what she's saying. All of this, I think, helps to avoid the fear and anxiety which are so detrimental to any interpreting performance, and which compound the tendency to get bogged down in expression. And then finally, to be selective, if at all possible. I think it probably is best to avoid very flowery speeches where the mode of expression is highly significant, if one knows in advance, of course. This is perhaps a bit idealistic. To opt for conferences that are more predictable, with more technical content. Okay, those are things we don't necessarily have total control over. But what we do have control over is to be able to prepare thoroughly, and so to only accept conferences in B for which we have time to prepare. I mentioned the problems at the end of the preceding part, and we saw that there were, I think, very real problems. Are there solutions? Yes, I think there are in part. I don't think that working into B is ever going to be the same as working into A. I don't say not as good as, but not the same, probably. I think the solutions are, on the one hand, to minimize the expression deficit by rigorous and continuous language enhancement, by building up a toolkit, probably also by learning a number of set phrases that come up frequently in conferences, more or less by heart, so that one can build up confidence and save time. So beginnings and endings and thankings and apologizing and giving the floor and the like. And by active preparation. And then I think that one needs to maximize the comprehension bonus by focusing on the communication of a message and being, of course, very realistic about proficiency in B generally, so not being overcritical of one's output. My conclusion is actually very optimistic. I think that once one accepts that a B language is not an A language, things become simpler. And also, working into B is an extremely powerful driver for improvement and progress. So long as one doesn't come out of conferences thinking, oh, that was ghastly, I can't even bear to think it over anymore, but comes out saying, okay, that didn't go so well, why? And trying to improve. A lot can be learnt from working in simultaneous into B. One can learn a lot from one's own performance, from listening to colleagues, especially if one is fortunate enough to work with colleagues who are working into A language, of course, listening to the delegates, and if you can bear it, recording oneself and listening critically afterwards. So practice doesn't necessarily make perfect, but it certainly helps. And I would say, as a final word, that I think that working in to be in simultaneous can be not only satisfactory for the listeners, which we saw it was, but can also be satisfying for the interpreter. So if you have any questions or comments.
Thank you very much. Yes, if you do have any questions, now's the time. And if anyone online would like to ask any questions, it's a little bit more complicated. They need to go back to the Dim meeting and put their question in the chat there, and I will then read it out. But perhaps we'd start with some questions from the room, if there are any.
There's two things. I was wondering if, as you say, people are very shy of working into B for TV or political meetings. Isn't that just because they're afraid of the audience, and not so much because they think that their work is not going to be as good? That's one thing. And the other thing is, have you been looking at all into the time dimension of the B? That is, the B that used to be great when you had just been living in a country and that may not be so great 20 years later, or the B of the person who is living with somebody who speaks that language on a daily basis at home, and then they split up, and then their B suddenly. Have you been looking into that?
To answer the first question, that they're afraid of the audience, I think it amounts to the same thing. Why would they be so afraid of the audience when working into B and not into A? Or is it? So I think there is this fear. I think also that there is a kind of underlying fear for those of us who were trained in training centres, perhaps in France. I don't know about elsewhere. A fear that somehow we shouldn't be doing this, that it's not legitimate. So that, yes, may be part of it, certainly. I think that one is slower, or can be slower, working into B, and that's why perhaps television or a very fast political debate may be more difficult. These are just hunches. To come to the problem of a B not being constant, at the beginning, when I mentioned the sort of different language backgrounds, I should have perhaps added that as well, that of course what is a B now may not always be a B. It may become almost an A, and it may become a C. So our languages change all the time, and I think that is something that we as interpreters are actually very aware of, and that the average person is not aware of. They assume that you have a native language, an A language, we would call it, and that it's always going to be your mother tongue and it's always going to be perfectly sound. Well, I guess it will always be your mother tongue, but it doesn't, as we all know, is not always necessarily very sound. And of course the same is true for a B language, and obviously a B language requires an awful lot of work. And that's why I stress the fact that there's a need for very rigorous and continuous language enhancement in B. And it's true that if you lose a context in which that enhancement happens a little bit more easily, then you're going to have to do more deliberate, structured language enhancement to offset that, I think. Again, I think that working into B in simultaneous, and probably consecutive too for that matter, is a good reminder from time to time that language enhancement is necessary. And I guess one should, spend time regularly in the country of the B language as well.
Yes, I would like to more make a comment, but also ask a question. My impression, I found this very interesting, the analysis, and as all of us, of course, I feel even more interested because I've worked a lot into my B language during my career, actually. During the last 15 years, I've mostly worked into B, working at the Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. And at the beginning, indeed, I thought it was almost impossible. but then, well, with practice, acquired many of these helpful instruments. And I agreed with everything you said, and with both positions about the pluses and the minuses. But I would think that that depending on the difficulty, it can be easier or less easy to work into A or into B. And according to me, there is an easy level in which indeed working into B can be very satisfying and satisfactory. Then there is like a normal difficulty, when it's pretty difficult, and when it's more satisfying if you work into your A language and you can really feel satisfied with your work. But according to my experience at the tribunal, sometimes we would have an extreme difficulty in which we were also encouraged to turn off the microphone, but we wouldn't if we didn't have to. So like the 2% of overlapping speakers and next to impossible speeches. And in these situations, personally, I found out that I could work better into B, thanks once again to this intuition. And sometimes I would myself find it into B, when it became, in my own experience, when it became, you know, literally sometimes we would have overlapping speakers, and as it's the tribunal, you have to say everything, and somehow I would just do the question and the answer, but I could do it when I would work into B. When it would be from B into A, in these situations, and it was considered as totally legitimate, I would just say this is too fast, they're overlapping, can they be... So I'm wondering if you took these sort of 3 levels of difficulty into account in your studies.
No, I hadn't identified 3 levels of difficulty. I had identified a sort of continuum of difficulty. You know, going from the relatively easy. I've never really had an easy conference in my life, but relatively easy to the very, or almost impossible, or impossible. What you say is interesting, and I think it's also due to familiarity. I said that in B, the problems one has is that a B language expression is less spontaneous and less intuitive. Now, obviously, if one is very familiar with a working environment, as you are at the tribunal, or I am at the OECD, for instance, then that difficulty is considerably reduced, because there are certain patterns, there are patterns used by the speakers, there are certain subjects that are discussed over and over, there's the whole background to the conferences with which one's very familiar. And so one develops a considerable degree of familiarity, not just in understanding, but also in expression. And that may indeed offset the disadvantages of the B. And I think also you said when it became very difficult and there was an overlap and speakers were very fast, perhaps, this is just a supposition, a hypothesis, but perhaps at that stage you no longer had time to ask yourself any questions about the expression. You just had to get on with it. And so that sort of cancelled out the expression deficit worries I was mentioning. And as you're very used to working into your B language, you've developed lots of patterns and it's become a habit that's become very ingrained. So it's quite possible, as you say, that perhaps once you manage to get rid of the doubts and the worries, you find that, yes, you can do it perfectly well and you can really make the most of the comprehension bonus. So I'm quite prepared to accept, and indeed I recognise to some extent what you've said there.
Can I just share with everyone quickly a couple of comments and questions that have come in from the people who are watching and listening online. The first one, I'm afraid I'm not sure who's sent it in, but it goes, many thanks, Claire, that was very insightful and interesting. If anything, I feel you're maybe a little pessimistic, as with thorough and well-supervised practice, the combined advantages of the A-B combination make it a truly viable and totally acceptable way of doing simultaneous. It's never going to be easy, but as you say, once one has accepted that a B is not an A, it is possible to forge ahead. So that was one comment. And then another, Ulla Lace from Estonia, if I recall, says, thank you for a brilliant and intriguing presentation. Any comments on working into B that is meant just for the delegates, as opposed to working into B for a multi-booth meeting? assume where relay is involved.
Yes,
And then any chance of getting the slides as a second question from Ulla.
Okay. Well, hello to Ulla, and thank you to the first person for the anonymous comment. Regarding the pessimism, I was actually trying to be optimistic. I'm fairly optimistic. I thought I was being optimistic. The reason it may sound slightly grudging or pessimistic is because I'm having to reassure myself a lot, because I was exposed to quite a lot of negative advice about working in simultaneous interbe, and it took me a very long time to actually say, okay, well, I'm going to do this. So I'm probably trying to still, 30 years on, to reassure myself, hence perhaps the slightly negative tone. But you can see that the delegates questioned were fairly optimistic. Ulla, about the relay, I take it, working for colleagues versus working for delegates. I didn't mention, but in the user satisfaction survey I did also talk to colleagues who had taken on relay. And the reactions were actually very similar to the reactions of the delegates. I should point out that the delegates, to use our jargon, that I interviewed were people who were very familiar with conferences generally. They attended regularly meetings in Brussels and Geneva and Paris. So they had a very clear idea of what they expected from the interpreter, and their expectations were very similar to the expectations of colleagues taking on relay. In other words, that it be clear, it makes sense, and the terminology be correct. So I don't think there's a lot of difference. Possibly the anxiety is greater still when one's being taken on relay, because colleagues can be very critical. And they can also be instrumental in making or breaking a reputation. So perhaps the stakes are somewhat higher in some way. And all the more reason to focus on the communication and trying to provide a useful feed that can then be used by another booth. So I don't really think it makes any significant difference, except that the anxieties may be slightly different. And basically, the whole thrust of my presentation was to try and find ways to combat this anxiety, which is not helpful, and I think is actually generally not justified.
Any more questions from
Voilà. Thanks a lot, Claire, for a very interesting presentation as well. Have you thought about, well, let's say the problem of the B language is probably, there's a particular problem with English. As you said, you know, if you've got Chinese into French, nobody will bother about the accent or as long as the meaning is there. If you work into French or into English, or let's say into Spanish and English in Spain and so forth, where English is supposed to be spoken and understood by everybody else, I think it puts a different slant on the whole story, you know, different perspective. And as you said, I think that people don't really care if the expression is not perfect, as long as they understand what's going on. But unfortunately, or I would even say that some listeners like B language interpreters because they understand them better, because they're not themselves English native speakers, and they find it difficult to follow good English. However, for B language interpreters or interpreters working into their B language, there's a real problem, which is globish, because what we hear in most conferences is not proper English. And we find it very difficult to improve our own English because we hear that sort of poor English or limited English all the time. So I don't know what you've found out about that.
No, I think I would agree with much of what you've said. Obviously, it's very different working into English B from the language of the country you're in, which is usually the pattern that happens now. And this is them working, say, from Chinese or Japanese here in France into French, which is a bit of a problem because I think the bulk of the private market worldwide now is English plus national language. I think there are a number of issues here. You're probably right in saying that some users may even prefer a good B to perhaps an over-ambitious A, someone who's trying to be a bit too clever, perhaps, for the users. So long as the English B is not irritating in any way, distracting, irritating, I would tend to agree. I think the problem is that because markets, freelance markets, increasingly are national language plus English, people are being more or less forced into working into English B, even if it's not really a B, because otherwise they won't work. And that's quite understandable in terms of financial decision, a career choice. It's not always conducive to quality. And not only that, but they are exposed to quite poor English in the conferences. So I would agree, and everything I've said is assuming that the B language is a flexible instrument that can be used to express all of the ideas. Not an A, but that can be used to express all of the ideas. Basically, I think that one has to have some kind of internal benchmark. Now, here in Paris, that's possible because we're working alongside people who have, in my instance, a French A, in yours an English A, so that gives us a benchmark to work against and to improve towards. There are some markets, I suspect, where nearly everybody has an English B, and so that benchmark is lacking, and there's not the same impetus to improve. I think working in simultaneous into a B language requires, and I keep repeating this, but really constant language enhancement and real efforts to ensure that the language remains active, fluent, clear. And if there is a benchmark to work against, then that's very good. The benchmark may also be colleagues who have an excellent B. And if there's not, then one has to develop an internal, ambitious benchmark to work towards, I think. But I would agree about some users actually possibly preferring a B.
Okay, well, if there are no questions.
Can I add something? Just, Claire, you spoke about people who are very afraid when they have to work into B. But there are also many colleagues who are more than happy to do it and who are really very satisfied with their work into B, which is sometimes justified, sometimes isn't. And I think when you mentioned the Hungarian market, I don't know many things about the Hungarian market, but I do know about the ex-Yugoslav market quite a lot. And there it's a question of prestige. If you don't work into a foreign language, you're considered to be a less good interpreter, which can be a bit of a problem sometimes.
Yes, thank you, Andrea, because I think that's a very important point, and it sort of supplements Martine's point, and it's not something that I emphasised enough. I was working on the assumption that we were all conscientious and had reasonable B languages, and which is actually very optimistic and idealistic. Yes, there is clearly a temptation for all kinds of reasons, which I've already mentioned in the previous answer, to work into B, even if the B is not a very good B, let's say, or a very usable B. Honestly, I don't quite know what can be done about that in immediate terms. The longer term is to ensure that there are good training courses that are set up which provide people with this benchmark. In other words, it's dinned into them that they have to attain a certain level of quality, and they're never satisfied with less than that. And then to develop a kind of critical mass on the market in terms of quality. But it's true that I'm always a little bit suspicious when people say, oh, I love working into B and it's really good and it's just as easy as working into A, that's often not a very good sign. It's perhaps that they don't have a sufficiently demanding benchmark. But the answer is very, very long term in developing and taking part in training courses and ensuring a greater presence perhaps for AIC and active work for AIC and other associations. Just generally, I think.
Got another comment online before we take another one from the room. It's Chris DeFortis, who
Yes.
was actually behind the previous anonymous comment. He's a senior interpreter at NATO, for those of you who don't know him, but I think probably many of you may have come across him either in the booth or when you were training yourselves. He says, it's interesting that some of what is being said seems to confirm the NATO and SCIC user satisfaction surveys, in that we interpreters are perhaps wrong in aiming for perfect expression or authentic accent, which are apparently of secondary importance to users. I feel that one problem is the lack of accuracy and realism, which you referred to in interpreters' self-assessment when working into B.
Yes, I agree, yes. I did see the results of the SCIC user satisfaction survey, which was something like 5,000 people who were questioned, which was not the case in my very, very modest and small satisfaction survey. And indeed, the findings were very similar, yes.
My question is concerning interpretation, interpreters, students training in simultaneous interpretation. Is training students into B language, their B language, different from training them into A language? Because I have now more and more students with French A, Japanese B combination, so I have now second-year students whom I have to train to simultaneously interpret into Japanese. And I'm asking to myself which will be the best way to train them.
My feeling is that training students to do simultaneous into B is like training them to do simultaneous into A, only more so. In other words, all of the principles that one needs to apply to help a student learn to get away from the words, to focus on clarity, to see the bigger picture, all of that has to be done much, much more rigorously when training them to work into B. And I think there is a little bit of a difference in that they need more opportunity for active preparation of the class, so they must be given the subject in advance. They must be given some kind of background material so that they can prepare the ways in which they're going to say things, so they don't have to worry about that once they're in the booth. And I think they also need an example. So I think that it's much more useful than working into A, or that it's also useful if the trainer can actually sit alongside them and alternate. They do 5 minutes each so that they can hear a native speaker working. Not that they necessarily want to imitate exactly the way the native speaker is working, but simply to pick up ideas about expression. And another thing I think that's different is that you have to somehow avoid the simultaneous into B class becoming a language class, and at the same time still provide useful advice about language. So that is, it makes the training of simultaneous into B not fundamentally different from A, but I think it has to be done, it has to be more carefully planned, the classes have to be more carefully planned. One has to be more strict about insisting on clarity and communication, and there have to be more examples given of professional interpretation. would be my feeling. But you probably have an idea, Hiromi. You've been doing this quite a lot. So.
Just take one more question online quickly. Another anonymous one, I'm afraid. Thank you very much for the informative talk. I have a question regarding the importance of accent. Do you think that jury members in exams would prefer candidates to have a more natural accent? In other words, how important is accent in passing graduation exams and accreditation exams at major international institutions?
Well, thank you for the question. I can't answer the latter part of the question. For the former part, again, we come back to this notion of what is distracting or irritating. An accent can be, without being very strong, very irritating. In English, it can be quite irritating if the stress is wrong, perhaps more than the accent as such. So clearly anything that's going to distract the listener from actually listening to the message is not really acceptable. So it's not a matter of setting a standard and saying that beyond X variation with a native accent, it's no longer acceptable. It's, of course, subjective as well, unfortunately. But a panel does comprise a number of native speakers, or should comprise a number of native speakers, and, of course, non-native speakers who understand that language. Now, my feeling is that the emphasis should really be on, is it irritating or distracting, and if it's not, then it should be disregarded. And as I indicated earlier, a very authentic accent in B can actually be a problem, because it may be very authentic and then suddenly slip. People will start to wonder, but is this person an English A or a French A after all? And also, there will almost inevitably be a discrepancy between the authentic accent and some of the expression content. And that can be distracting for listeners. So I'm not saying if you happen to have an authentic accent in your B language, you should get rid of it. But it can be a problem if the rest is not up to scratch.
Sorry to come back. As you probably know, the private market sector is meeting in Vienna this weekend, and there's a special workshop organized by AIC on quality on the Friday. Now, do you have any advice to help? Yeah, well, it's the whole discussion about quality, because, of course, as the private market sector, we want to perhaps push for quality surveys or see what we could do with our clients and our listeners and get some feedback from them. But of course, quality is a very delicate topic because we don't really know what we mean by quality. And when referring to the users survey, they show that quality for them is not what quality is for us, or we have different understandings. And perhaps you can tell us a little bit what you think about that.
I'm not sure that we have different understanding of what quality is, because, as I said, the interpreters taking on relay used almost the same words in defining what they expected of the feed interpretation as did the delegates. I think perhaps as interpreters we're lovers of language, and so we perhaps attach more importance than some of our listeners do to very interesting expressions and lovely words and unusual expression features, which is not necessarily a priority. But I think that we know that that is not really what we mean by quality. It's just a kind of bonus and something that we enjoy about interpreting. The question is interesting, as they say. It's the whole issue of quality is a huge problem, and I consider in some ways that I've tried through my work at AZ and in other training contexts over the last 30 years to do something to ensure that quality is maintained or even improved, and to transmit high standards to beginners. To me, I think it's very useful to go out and to talk to users. I'm not sure that the standard kind of user satisfaction survey where they tick boxes and are that useful now that the first ones have been done. I think the first ones were, but they've been done. And the results are always very similar, that they want meaning, they want accuracy, they want, okay, so we know all that. But I think that as interpreters generally, we tend to shy away from our users a lot. We sort of rush off at lunchtime, we don't go and talk to them during coffee breaks, and we want to get away very quickly at the end of the day. And it may be, without being intrusive and annoying, it may be generally useful if we were to do more to strike up contacts with our users and to talk to them and discuss quality issues generally. And also explain what it is we need in order to be able to provide quality, because I think increasingly the conference conditions are such that it's extremely difficult to ensure quality, no matter how good theoretically the interpreters are. And that's perhaps also a lack of communication. And that's why I mentioned AIC generally, because I think that there is perhaps something that AIC or the various regions in AIC could do to go out towards our users more and try and have more of a dialogue with them and explain perhaps what interpreting is, what communication in a conference setting is, and how to best communicate. And then the other way of improving quality is through training, I think. Training and further training and continuous training and constantly trying to ensure that standards don't slide and that we don't become complacent.
Now, I'm afraid I've just been told that the university will be closing its doors at 8:30, and if we don't wrap up now, we won't get out of the building tonight. So I apologise to those who had more questions. Thank you very much, everybody, for coming. Thank you very much to Claire for an excellent talk.